From mastering psychometric testing at JCU to running her own private practice on the Sunshine Coast, Debbie Van Zoelen demonstrates how psychology training creates a foundation for clinical excellence. Stick around as she shares how her psychology degree still guides her daily practice. Professionally Psyched is the podcast that brings you cutting-edge psychology research and real-world insights from our psych community of clinicians, researchers, and educators alike. In our special alumni spotlights, we chat to graduates from our psychology degree programs about how their skills learned in the classroom have become powerful tools supporting diverse career journeys and successes. Hi everyone and welcome to Professionally Psyched. I'm Jessica Muller, PhD candidate in Public Health at James Cook University, and before we get started we'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we record, and for me today that's the Bindal and Wulgurukaba peoples. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures from wherever you may be tuning in from across the country. In this Alumni Spotlight episode, Dr. Amanda Krause speaks with clinical psychologist Debbie Van Zoelen about transforming JCU's ethics training and psychometric assessment skills into effective clinical practice. From diagnosing autism in Mount Isa to treating PTSD on the Sunshine Coast, Debbie reveals how undergraduate foundations continue to support her work with diverse clients, all while maintaining a crucial work-life balance. So grab your headphones and get ready to get professionally psyched about applying classroom theory to real-world clinical settings. Enjoy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today. To get started, would you please introduce yourself?
So I'm Debbie Van Zoelen, and I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice on the Sunshine Coast.
Could you tell me a little bit about the evolution of your career from when you graduated, both in terms of the bachelor's into the master's and then to get to where you are today?
Yeah, so when I completed my bachelor's, I went out to Mount Isa to work in Centacare, which is like a non-government organisation, working as a case manager for homelessness with the view to going into family counselling position a little bit later on, probably about close to a year later on, and then looking to do the 4+2 pathway. But just as I was about to sign up for the 4+2 pathway, I found out that I had been successful to get into the master's program. So that's how that started. And then from there, I had some placements in Mount Isa at Northwest Remote Health while doing the master's, and Queensland Health, and then came back to JCU Townsville to do the clinical placement. And then from there went back into Mount Isa to work at Queensland Health in the adult mental health team. I was very lucky to get a clinical lead role. It's a very good way to launch a career to go to rural and remote areas, because they're obviously not the easiest places to live. However, you make really good friendships, you get really good experience, and you get to do things probably that you wouldn't get to do so on the coast, for example.
That's excellent. Is there anything that you honed in on as a skill when you were out remote that you bring into your practice now?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate when I was doing my master's, the clinical placement at JCU, that one of the supervisors there had been really thoroughly trained in delivering an ADOS, which is an autism diagnostic observation schedule. And that skill I was able to use in Mount Isa, and then now I do that over here in my private practice.
You make the leap from working in Queensland Health in these various roles to now working in private practice?
So I hadn't planned. I was going to stay in Mount Isa for a little bit longer. In between that, I actually went over to Western Australia as well, up to a town called Derby, which is just north of Broome. And I worked in the child mental health team there. And then I decided to go back to Queensland Health in Mount Isa. And then when I was nearing my sort of end of the master's degree and getting the thesis done and all of that, my adult kids were on the Sunshine Coast and calling me to come home, basically. So I moved over to the Sunshine Coast, and then I got a position working in a practice with lots of psychologists and a couple of GPs and a couple of psychiatrists, quite a big practice over in Morayfield. And that's where I started to do my first, I guess, wasn't really private, it's still private practice, but it wasn't my own private practice, if that makes sense. Because it's quite daunting when you transition to going into your own private practice. It's like, oh, should I do this? Will I be successful? Will I be able to manage it all? Yeah, a lot of I guess a little bit of fear sets in when you go to do it on your own. So I stayed in that practice for about a year, and then I transitioned into my own private practice, and it's been wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
That's excellent. Could
Yeah.
you tell me a little bit about how it differs now that you're running your own private practice?
Okay, so I get a lot of flexibility. So if I choose that I want to have a day off over here, I make that free for myself, which is wonderful. I can work the hours that I want to work, which is also wonderful. The downfall is the administration work. So I hate admin. And I did have my daughter working for me a bit, doing some admin, helping me, assisting me with things. But she's gone off to do her own things now. So it's left me with, I have to do it all on my own. And sometimes that can be quite challenging because you go, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. Because I'm not a bookkeeper. I don't like doing those things. So yeah, that's the hard part of it, I guess, is the bookkeeping and the administration side of everything. So for example, I do all my phone calls. So if I'm ringing a client, I like to find out what they're looking for to see if we're going to be a good fit for each other and that type of thing. It's kind of like being a one-man band for everything. Yeah, and sometimes that can get a bit harsh, but I do know how to do the self-care thing. So I think that's the big important tip from that. So when you come home from work in your own private practice, there's still emails to answer. There's still all these other things. But I have learned, okay, I won't look at them today. I'll look at them in the morning.
Do
Yeah.
you have any good recommendations? Because I feel like self-care and separating work from life is something that all of us, regardless of
Yeah.
our role, need to focus on. Do you have any tips and tricks to offer?
Well, I would suggest as psychologists, we often use mindfulness-based meditations and things for our clients, and then we forget to do them ourselves. So I make sure that I do those. Probably not every day, but because some days for example, I'll go and do a Qigong class, which is a bit like Tai Chi. It's sort of like breath work and a bit of meditation. I do that once a week, and I also go swimming because that's my form of exercise. I'm not a jogger, but I do like to swim. So I try and go to the pool a couple of times a week as well. And then I've got a dog, so I take my dog for a walk. Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah.
Thinking back to your undergrad psychology degree, what do you rely on from that in terms of skills or knowledge that really plays a role still in your current day-to-day?
Okay, that's a good question. Probably a lot of those things. So I had some amazing lecturers. They were really good. So we had, I think the ethics side of things and is really important to, bring in every day, all the time, because you have to be very non-judgmental. You have to be able to say, well, is this something I am capable of assisting with, or is it out of my league? Do I need to refer on? Those sorts of things. Psychometric testing. I think that is one of the most valuable things ever, because if you don't know what's going on for the client, you can't really inform the best treatment, I guess. So I do a lot of questionnaires and things like that with clients, because often in the first session, it's just building rapport and things like that. And then trying to get a context to what's going on for them, and then digging a little bit deeper with, okay, what is actually going on here? And usually the questionnaires and things can really hone in on what is actually the issue, the real issues. And then from there, you can bring it to the client and say, okay, well, I noticed this, you answered this question this way. Tell me a bit more about that. And that's a really, really good way to really get more information from the client as well, because they go, oh, yeah, that's me. That's exactly what's going on.
Mhm. With that psychometric testing, are you using a particular scale? Does it depend on the client? How do you choose what tools you can use?
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, one of the biggest ones is always depression and anxiety. So we try and always do a DAS, the depression and anxiety scale, and that gives us a bit of information. But often things have advanced so much now, you don't have to actually score all of these things anymore. You can actually do the online versions. So for example, I do see a lot of clients with PTSD. And I can usually pretty much go, okay, I think I'll send you that one. And then, yeah, it comes up with all the symptoms. Self-esteem scales. If I'm working with children, there's the children ARCADS and Spence anxiety scales. And yeah, so there's a lot of different scales. And they keep coming out with more and more, depending on which way you want to go with things.
And I suppose even if the computer is doing the calculations, you still need to understand what that's spitting back at you in order to create a treatment plan, right?
Yes, you do. And quite often, so what comes back to you, because I've done most of these scales manually in the past, I sort of already know what I'm looking at. But there are new scales that I have to go in and think, okay, what does this mean? But they do give an interpretive text with it. And often just going and looking at how they've answered each question can guide you. They say they have this symptom all the time, or they only have it sometimes. We can hone in on where are the points where it's really affecting their day-to-day living.
Is there a particular area or diagnosis, treatment that you find really fascinating, and does that steer who you work with?
That's a really good question too, because I work with children and adolescents and adults. Okay, so for children, I'm very much doing a lot of ASD, ADHD diagnosing, and anxiety. Anxiety is a big one with a lot of the kids too. And then report writing is, quite, heavy duty. So, because it takes 4 or 5 hours to write a good report for someone, and you have to be very accurate with what you're doing, I guess, too. Then with adults, I do have a bit of a mixture. Quite often a lot of PTSD coming through from maybe motor vehicle accidents, or people who are working on the front line, such as firefighters, teachers. Even teachers are quite a lot of PTSD in that group of people. And then just your everyday depression and anxiety. So I'll use the CBT is obviously one of the go-tos, but with PTSD, I use cognitive processing therapy, which I think is really quite helpful. PTSD is quite an interesting one because it's presents so differently for everybody that has it. And then you have to really focus in, okay, what are the main symptoms? So you pick apart the criteria, like avoidance, for example. That's usually a very high one in PTSD. You might get somebody, so for example, I have someone at the moment that is really resistant to doing any form of relaxation. They're happy just going to the gym and getting it out that way, but it's not working. They need to go back and reset their nervous system because the hyperarousal is so high. So you bring in whatever you start to target, and you think, okay, well, that didn't work. So how can I get that person? What can I do differently in the next session? Maybe there's something else. They might not like to do mindfulness meditation. They might want to do just some progressive muscle relaxation, or they might want to do some breathing techniques. Yeah.
With all of those different techniques, do you see any current big issues that the next graduating set of psychology graduates might be able to tackle in our industry?
Oh, I guess it has been difficult to get people to understand how important learning to breathe properly, learning to relax, learning to do those things is to everybody. Doesn't matter who you are. Like I've taught all my kids to do it, and they all practice these things. So they go off and do breathwork classes, and I think it is a growing thing anyway, and it's becoming more acceptable. But with older people, it's often very difficult because they've never, ever done anything like that, and they find it irritating, and they find it just like, oh, I haven't got time to do that, right? There's always an excuse that comes in. So I guess if the new graduates could find a way to really relay the importance of it. I've gotten better at it, but it takes sometimes a lot of work to really sort of get that across to somebody how important that is. And I suppose using fact sheets and things like that, they can be helpful, but often they don't read them. They might read it, but I don't think they take it on. And often I think sending them to classes is a better option too, because just doing it at home, if you're foreign to it, it's very difficult. But I've sort of gone down the line of saying, well, these people do this here in this area. How about you try something like that? And I give them a list of different people doing maybe the Qigong, which I go to, meditation classes, breathwork classes, and getting them off to a class means that they're immersed in it, and they start to learn how good it is for themselves. And then from there, they can practice at home as well.
I think that's a great point to end on, that we have to learn to develop these skills, both for ourselves and to assist other people. So Debbie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been lovely chatting to you.
Yeah, lovely chatting to you too. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Professionally Psyched. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the ongoing support of our psych community. If you'd like to show your support, or if you want us to cover anything on the pod, reach out via our emails, and don't forget you can listen to full episodes on Spotify.